The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, scholar Richard Kahlenberg on what progressive Democrats can learn from Robert Kennedy about economic populism and race. Author Ben Hecht on what's actually working to close America's racial equity divide. Plus, Bill Press talks insider trading and politicians caught on tape with political reporter Mat Laslo. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. 50 years ago, Robert Kennedy ran an economically populist campaign that reached across America's deep racial divide. Richard Kahlenberg says his legacy matters now more than ever. And we say hello to Richard Kahlenberg. He's a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, where he focuses on education, equal opportunity, and civil rights. Richard Kahlenberg, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Well, glad to be with you.
And our pleasure to have you with us. It has been just over 50 years since Robert Kennedy was assassinated on June 5th, 1968. To mark this sad anniversary, you wrote a report for the Century Foundation titled The Inclusive Populism of Robert F. Kennedy. And you note that when Robert Kennedy began his campaign to challenge Lyndon Johnson for the Democratic presidential nomination, he faced a challenge: how to unite working-class whites and African Americans. What was happening in that moment that made it such a challenge?
Well, there were two big things going on. For years, under Franklin Roosevelt and subsequent Democrats, there was a strong coalition of working-class whites and African Americans around common issues of class inequality. But then there were two disruptors. The first was the Civil Rights Movement, which was sweeping the country in the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and there were some working-class whites, particularly in the South, who were resistant to that, and we saw many of them swing to Barry Goldwater in the 1964 election. But it was more complicated than just white racism. There was also a fair amount of rioting going on in 1965, 66, 67. Cities were burning, and many working-class whites were upset about that, didn't feel that progressives were reacting strongly enough to that. And then the second big issue was Vietnam. I think most historians recognize that the Vietnam War was really a mistake. There were a lot of missteps by the United States, but at the time, many white working-class voters saw some of the protests on college campuses and elsewhere as going too far in their view, going after American patriotism. And so those two things were driving working-class whites and African Americans and Latinos, who had been natural allies, apart at that moment. And Robert Kennedy, who was entering the 1968 presidential campaign, was put in an awkward position because he was in favor of civil rights. He was opposed to the Vietnam War. So the easiest alliance would have been for him to put together a coalition of kind of upper middle class, educated whites and African Americans and Latinos. But he waited too long to get into the race, and Senator Eugene McCarthy was already in the race as the peace candidate and got many of those upper middle class voters. So Robert Kennedy had to try to cobble together that difficult coalition of working class whites and African Americans.
Yeah, and your report goes into great detail about how Robert Kennedy went about rebuilding that coalition, and it begins with his focus on economics. What was his message?
Well, he told a reporter, Jack Newfield, we have to convince, in the parlance of the time, Negroes and poor whites to see their common interests. And so he pounded away at what he thought was really the easiest issue for people to understand, which is that wealthy people in this country were not paying their fair share of taxes, and they were not carrying the weight that they should. And moreover, he would make it more vivid by going after particular people. So he would name names. He would talk about a billionaire, H.L. Hunt, who was paying $200 in taxes, and it really went after that. The business community was strongly opposed to Robert Kennedy on this issue of taxation, and they. He in the polls, he was the least popular among all the various candidates. The other thing is he was really relentless on this issue of economic inequality. Sometimes today, progressives will talk about economic inequality and then shift to lots of other issues, and it wasn't episodic for Robert Kennedy. He pounded away at those issues relentlessly.
Well, and as you also write in your report, he knew he had to go beyond economics to social issues such as law and order, but we know that the law and order issue can be used by some candidates as a dog whistle appeal to racism. How did Robert Kennedy avoid that?
Yeah, he was very careful to talk about law and order in a way that was quite different than someone like Governor George Wallace, the segregationists, or Richard Nixon, who would use law and order in a way that had a strong racial undertone. This was part of Robert Kennedy's larger effort to say we not only have to respect the interests of working class people, but their values as well. And so law and order at a time when there's widespread rioting going on in city after city was very popular among working class people, really of all races. I mean, Kennedy didn't want to be for lawlessness and disorder. He really ran as one colleague put it, as kind of the sheriff of the country. He reminded people that he was had been as Attorney General, the chief law enforcement officer, and yet he always coupled that message of law and order, which is a phrase he did use, with a strong civil rights message, a strong message of anti-discrimination. And he would say to audiences of white factory workers, imagine if you couldn't get a job, to support your family because of the color of your skin. Imagine not being able to find a home in the neighborhood that you wanted because people were discriminated against you. So he talked about the need to maintain order, but at the same time always talked about what was the root source of that anger in the African American community, and the need to address those sources as well.
And he also broached the divisive issue of welfare without evoking the racist image of the welfare queen. How did he challenge welfare with an inclusive appeal? Yeah.
Well, in later years, Ronald Reagan was famous for talking about welfare queens, people who were cheating the system. And Robert Kennedy was also critical of welfare, but from a very different angle. So in one of his TV commercials, he talked about, he said, I think welfare is demeaning and destructive of the human being and his family. So he wasn't for that policy. He really wanted to give people jobs so that they could feel good about themselves and have meaning in their lives. And so in one of his ads, he talked about the idea that someone should be able to go home and say to his or her family, I helped build this country. I am a participant in its greatest public venture. To be employed was in any capacity was something to be honored, and so Robert Kennedy did have that anti-welfare message, but in a way that was uplifting of people who were on welfare.
We're speaking with Richard Kahlenberg, a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, where he focuses on education, equal opportunity, and civil rights. Richard, this campaign took place in the middle of a very unpopular war in Vietnam, as you had alluded to earlier. How was he able to balance being tough on national security with a position that questioned the morality of the Vietnam War?
Right. So everyone in the country knew that Robert Kennedy was opposed to the Vietnam War, the way it was being conducted. He was very clear on that issue and talked about this as a question of morality. At the same time, he was able to communicate a toughness on national security issues that was different than other progressives at the time, or many other progressives at the time. And one way he did that was to suggest that he was not going to side with kind of upper middle class white college students who were protesting the war in a way that was disrespectful to the United States. And moreover, he went after kind of the class inequality aspects of the Vietnam War. And he told students at Notre Dame, it is unfair that you get a deferment from service in the war because you are in college. And so, those images would be broadcast on the evening news, and people knew that, yes, he had questions about the Vietnam War, but he wasn't siding with protesters who many working-class whites viewed as unsympathetic and unpatriotic. And as a result, there was some fascinating polling which suggested that Robert Kennedy, even though he was a peace candidate, did as well with supporters of the Vietnam War as opponents of that war.
That's interesting. Now, of course, we did not get to find out if he would have won the nomination, but what can you say about his campaign? Was it working?
It was remarkable. So he ran in a series of primaries, building up towards the California primary where he was assassinated, and in those primaries he was clearly on the road towards rebuilding this coalition of African Americans, Latinos, and working-class whites, including many working-class whites who in previous elections had supported George Wallace, the segregationist governor from Alabama. Some of the best evidence comes from the state of Indiana, where in precincts where Wallace had done quite well in 1964, when he was challenging Lyndon Johnson for the Democratic presidential nomination, Robert Kennedy also did well in those precincts. There's a lot of polling evidence to suggest that Kennedy, for many voters, the choice came down to one between Robert Kennedy and George Wallace. And this is truly remarkable because on the issue of civil rights, they were at polar opposites. Robert Kennedy was seen as the most sympathetic to making progress on civil rights, whereas George Wallace was the strongest opponent of advancements on civil rights. And yet, Kennedy was able to appeal not only to African Americans and Latinos, but also to these working-class whites who, many of whom had supported Governor Wallace.
What was it about this man that made him not only commit to an inclusive kind of populism, but be successful at it?
Yeah, well, I think much of it had to do with his particular biography. He was the brother of a slain and martyred president, John F. Kennedy, and so there was some his appeal that was derivative of John Kennedy's success with working class whites and African Americans. Part of it had to do with a personal toughness. He'd been campaign manager for his brother. He'd been attorney general. He'd been a prosecutor who went after labor leader Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters and corruptions and the unions. And so that was part of his appeal. But fundamentally, he had a basic respect for people of all races. And so I was at a book event with where I heard his daughter, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, speaking. And the question was raised, would Robert Kennedy have said that, large chunks of the American population are deplorables? And she said it never would have occurred to him in a million years to say something like that. He had too much respect for people and wanted to meet them where they were and try to bring out the best in them.
Boy, could we go for a dose of that today. And speaking of today, as you look out today at our political landscape, as many progressive Democrats struggle with these same issues, why is this still such a hard issue?
Well, I think that many Democrats are rightfully suspicious of the pervasive racism that is continues to plague our society, and at the same time, that leads them in too many situations to have a condescending attitude toward non-college educated voters in this country, the kind of a feeling of moral superiority that fails to recognize that working class and low income people of all races are hurting in this country. Van Jones tells a powerful story about a working class white father who'd been laid off from his job. He's got two kids. One is his son is on opioids and struggling for that reason. And then his daughter, who he's so proud of, goes off to college. And she comes back from college and starts lecturing him about his white privilege and patriarchal attitudes. And that's not the best way to reach voters like that. We don't need to scold or lecture people. We need to understand and really be more inclusive in our populism. Obviously, avoiding the terrible right-wing and racist populism of Donald Trump, but also being more inclusive of working class people of all races. I think that's one of the big lessons for progressives today. That here we have a model of Robert Kennedy, someone who was able to bridge that divide.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the specific policies you think that can be successful in realizing Robert Kennedy's vision?
I think the broader theme should be policies that embrace a liberalism without elitism on the one hand, and a populism without racism on the other. And so there are a number of specific policies that can embody that idea. One would be to go after corporations that are failing us. I mean, after the 2008 economic crisis, there was a sense that some of these banks were too big to fail, and also that they're too big to jail. And there's a lot of anger over that set of issues, and so I think that's part of what progressives could do today. The other big thing is to think about ways to get at the class inequality in our country and learn from the civil rights movement. Ben Jealous, who's running for governor in Maryland, has said that the biggest divide in this country today is not between black and white, it's between rich and poor. And so applying that lesson to particular policy areas could have a big impact. So, for example, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 makes employment discrimination illegal. Well, we ought to think about expanding that idea and saying it also ought to be illegal not only to discriminate based on race or gender or religion, but if you are trying to form a union, you're trying to join the middle class, you shouldn't just be fired, which is what employers do now, because while it's a technical violation of labor laws, the penalties are so weak that employers routinely flout the law. So make labor organizing a civil right. Try to integrate our schools by socioeconomic status as well as race, because all the research suggests concentrations of poverty are what drive inequality as opposed to a particular racial makeup. In the area of affirmative action, I think there's a powerful argument for expanding the concept to include disadvantaged people of all races. So President Obama said, his privileged daughters don't deserve a leg up, but economically disadvantaged students of all races, including African American, Latino, Asian, and white, deserve to have that special consideration in college admissions. And the final thing I mentioned is the idea of an economic fair housing act. We've now made it illegal to discriminate, by race in housing. Going back to the 1968 Fair Housing Act, but it's perfectly legal to discriminate based on government policies that treat people differently on the basis of income. So we have in lots of communities zoning laws that in effect say we're going to exclude working class and moderate income people of all races because in this neighborhood you've got to have we only allow single family homes. We're going to ban apartment buildings, and in some cases they even say you need a certain lot size. I mean, that's blatant economic discrimination, and we ought to be framing these issues in a way that suggests that we've had modest success with the civil rights movement. Let's apply those lessons to economic inequality.
A lot to learn. Richard Kahlenberg, a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, where he focuses on education, equal opportunity, and civil rights, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Richard, thank you so much for your time. We do appreciate it and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Oh, I would enjoy that very much. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, reclaiming the American dream for everyone. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
America's political history has been written in the fierce narrative of war. Not our country's many military clashes with foreign nations, but our own unending war for democracy in the USA. Generation after generation of moneyed elites have persisted in trying to take wealth and power from the workaday majority and concentrate both in their own hands to establish a de facto American aristocracy. Every time, the people have rebelled in organized mass struggles against the monopolists and financial royalists, literally battling for a little more economic fairness, social justice, and equal opportunity. And now the time of rebellion is upon us again, for we the people are suddenly in the grip of a brutish level of monopolistic power. Corporate concentration of markets, profits, workplace decision-making, political influence, and our nation's total wealth is surpassing that of the infamous era of robber barons. Apple, which just recently became the first U.S. corporation to reach a stock value of $1 trillion, is now larger than Bank of America, Boeing, Disney, Ford, Volkswagen, and 20 other brand-name giants combined. And the powerful tech industry is now controlled by just 5 superpowers, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Netflix, which raked in half of this year's stock price gains by the 500 largest corporations. Indeed, the recent gold rush of corporate mergers has created mega firms, shriveling competition in most industries: airlines, banks, drug companies, food, hospitals, hotels, law firms, media, oil, etc. Fewer and bigger corporations mean that those few attain overwhelming power over the rest of us. They're able to control workers' pay, jack up prices, dominate elections, and become even fewer, bigger, and more powerful. This is Jim Hightower saying it's an all-out corporate class war on the American people, and they're winning.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Ben Hecht has spent decades exploring strategies to combat racial disparities in wealth and income. His new book offers a blueprint on how to do just that. And we say hello to Ben Hecht. He's the president and CEO of Living Cities and the author of a new book titled Reclaiming the American Dream, Proven Solutions for Creating Economic Opportunity for All. Ben Hecht, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. The title of the book, of course, implies that the American dream is out of reach for many Americans. Why is this an important book for this moment?
Well, I think part of what we're experiencing right now in America is due to the economic frustration that's built up for pretty much the majority of the country for the last 40 years. And, I think of my own history where my grandparents were immigrants, and my father went to World War II, went to college on the GI Bill, bought a home through the FHA, and I kind of grew up thinking everyone had a chance to claim the American dream. And, of course, in 1967, when I was a kid right outside of Newark, and Newark was burning from the riots, I had some inclination that the American dream wasn't claimable by everybody, but I kind of always thought it was. And I think over the last 40 years, it's been really clear that it's not only not claimable for people who thought it long was, white people, but it's not claimable for the people who never really thought it was meant for them anyway, which were people of color. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I call it reclaiming, that what we really need to do is create the systems in America that make opportunity available for everyone. And the whole point of the book really is that that's already happening. that this is not a pipe dream. This is not just something happening in one or two communities on either coast. But for the last 10 or 12 years, leaders have been basically doing what needs to be done and to experiment with increasing income, building wealth, expanding educational opportunities, connecting people to opportunity physically and virtually, and ultimately creating the environment in their communities where we have an ongoing commitment to the greater good.
Now, the book focuses on what people are doing primarily at the local level to fight against inequality. Why is it important to look local as opposed to the federal level?
Yes, it really is. So I run a place called Living Cities, so we focus on cities. But the reason we do that is because the local level is where problems are solved. And the kinds of problems that need to be solved, who starts businesses to create jobs? How do you fix the education system? Those are local challenges with local solutions. They're really not federal. The federal government doesn't really come in and solve those problems. They can provide resources at times to help. They can create an environment through tax policy and the like to help. But really, it's about local leaders saying that we're not going to allow the conditions that have existed for the last 40 years to continue. One of the things that I think is fascinating is if you go to most mayors or local elected officials' websites, you will not see a party affiliation. They just simply don't associate themselves with a party as much as the ability to solve problems.
Mm-hmm. Now, you cover a lot of ground in the book, and really too much for us to cover in just one interview. But
yes, for sure.
But to get a sense of what you are talking about, let's start with home ownership. We know that the high cost of housing in many cities is making home ownership virtually impossible for many residents. But this is more about, or it's about more than buying a house. What is the significance of home ownership in closing the wealth gap in our country?
Yes, and I think that is one of the things that people don't really appreciate, is that the vast number of Americans who have wealth from a house, from the equity in a home. And that is even more true for people of color. So 90+% of the wealth of people of color in America come from equity in their homes. And so if you don't own a home, in large part, and you're a person of color, which again, it's important to understand, is our fastest growing population. It's going to be the population that has to be able to drive our consumer-driven economy. And right now, they have very little wealth. And if you look at percentage-wise, 72% of whites in America own a home. Around 40% of people of color own a home. And so if you don't own a home, you have no wealth. If you don't have wealth, you basically have incredible financial insecurity. The greatest way to end intergenerational poverty is through wealth. And so wealth is critical. And whether you agree with it or not, in America today, the number one way to build wealth is through homeownership.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Ben Hecht, President and CEO of Living Cities and the author of the new book titled Reclaiming the American Dream, Proven Solutions for Creating Economic Opportunity for All. Ben, what have you seen that is actually working to make homes affordable to more Americans?
So, the whole theme of my book is that these ideas have been not only developed locally, but they've been shared, stolen, made better locally too. What's great is there's this great competition among places. So if Pittsburgh had a good idea, Atlanta's going to steal it. They're going to credit Pittsburgh, but they're going to say we're going to do better. So there's this kind of co-opetition. And it's been fueled by technology, social networks, philanthropic dollars that make it easier to experiment. And so these ideas virally have spread. And so none of the ideas I talk about, and I'll give you an example with the homeownership, are just one-offs, that are only in New York or San Francisco. They're literally, I don't write about them unless they've landed in dozens of places, oftentimes hundreds of places. And so the homeownership is a good example. About 20 years ago, the Ford Foundation supported self-help credit union that started in Raleigh, North Carolina, but is now all over the country, to experiment with making loans that on alternative types of underwriting. So a little lower down payment, a little lower credit scoring or alternative credit scoring, a little higher income to debt ratios, and then sold those mortgages to the secondary markets, to Fannie and Freddie. And then they paid for researchers at the University of North Carolina to follow those mortgages over 20 years to see, well, are they performing worse than mortgages that are quote-unquote conventional or traditional? And what they found was they did not perform worse, in many ways performing better. Even during the 2007 crash, they performed as well as conventional mortgages. And those were for 50,000 Americans. Again, so this is not 100 people just in New York. These are 50,000 Americans. So we know how to do this. We know how to do it well. It just has to be everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Now, another area that you focus on is income, and you acknowledge that part of the problem in this country right now is the loss of manufacturing jobs.
For sure.
And the president says he'll fix this by renegotiating trade deals. You turn to another avenue, which is to support more startup companies and local innovation. Where and how is this working?
Yeah. So, Edith, I'm so glad you raised this, because this again is one of these hidden challenges in America that people don't want to really focus on. But the startup rates in America have been on a steady decline for the last 40 years. And 90% of all new jobs, about 2 million jobs a year, are new jobs that are created by companies that are 5 years or less, 5 years old or less. So if we're not creating new companies so they can, get to 5 years old, we are simply not going to have the jobs we need to be created. And so that problem is, it's just sitting back and saying, well, that's too bad. The question is, well, why is that? Why are we creating so many fewer startups? And one of the reasons is because our startup system has been really built for whites, for people that have friends and family with money. But like I was saying before, if you have the disparities where income and wealth aren't showing up in families of color, well, then they're not going to have the money to support families of color to start and grow businesses. And so what we're seeing across the country, including work that we're doing at Living Cities, is there's more and more people who are saying, I'm going to intentionally invest in venture capital funds that are run by people of color, investing in people of color. I'm going to work at a fund or a bank as a person of color to make loans to people of color. And we have people like Steve Case, one of the founders of AOL, and Mitch Kapoor, one of the founders of Lotus 123 years ago, who are going around the country putting their money and their credibility where their mouth is, and helping make this happen all over the country.
And, acting on this commitment to create economic opportunity for all requires a certain level of political will. Is it there? And if not, what do citizens need to do to make sure that it is there?
Yeah, it really is. One of the things that was so amazing when I was done with the book, I read through it all again, and with one simple question in mind, which is, do any laws or any regulations need to be changed for any of these ideas to happen in a local community? And shockingly, the answer was no. The only thing that has to happen is leaders in those communities have to decide that this is how they're going to change their own behavior or their behavior of their own institution. And so it really is about CEOs of companies saying, okay, I'm going to make it so my employees can use my tuition assistance to get a competency-based degree, which I talk about in the book. Or I'm going to be a superintendent of a school system, and I'm going to negotiate with my local college, and I'm going to make it so kids can graduate high school with an associate's degree for free, not just a high school degree. Or if I'm a citizen, I'm actually going to hold my local leaders accountable to do this oftentimes with these new tools that technology allows you to do, like change.org, where you can file a petition online and get people to sign it and pressure local officials to do what needs to be done, or use tools like See, Click, Fix or online 311 services, where you're basically making it, you're holding your local government leaders accountable.
Again, we're speaking with Ben Hecht, President and CEO of Living Cities, the author of a new book titled Reclaiming the American Dream, Proven Solutions for Creating Economic Opportunity for All. Ben, we also need a certain level of public will, a sense that we're in this together. And you addressed that in the last chapter. So what can we do to, in your words, to restore and sustain a commitment to the greater good?
Yeah, I really think this is critical to focus on, and it's something that literally all of us have to do. We have to re-knit our social fabric. It's really interesting. In doing the research for the book, I read de Tocqueville again, and he was in the U.S. in the early 1800s, and he walked away with a number of conclusions, but one was, this is a unique place because the people care about each other. There is a commitment to the social good that shows up in all kinds of ways that people associate with each other. And then 100 years later, a German sociologist, Myrtle, came to the U.S. and did a similar thing in the 1930s. And he said, oh my gosh, I still see what de Tocqueville saw, which is this incredible commitment to the greater good. And unfortunately, in the last 40 years, that has sort of been frayed. It's been really kind of dissolved. And that kind of commitment to the greater good, this idea that we have to look out for each other, has become this sort of, it's all about me. And I think what I've seen, where I've seen this start to be reknit, has been places where there's this virtuous interaction between effective local government that not only gets on the bully pulpit and says we need to care about each other, but actually shows that government is going to get better, improve their own performance and lead by example, plus engaged citizens who are actually helping government be better, or working in their own communities, plus a new civic infrastructure of local leaders, a lot of them corporate, so CEOs, who are saying we need to have the long view. Government, local government, mayors, county executives may come and go 4 or 8 years, but we need to say this is our community and we need to be long-term stewards of it. And the virtuous interaction of the three of those is really creating this commitment to the greater good that I think is what we need for the long term, to really, to get to what you guys are all about, to really reinstill the core elements of the democracy that has long made us this, city on the hill.
And it goes right back to the title of your book, Reclaiming the American Dream. I mean, we've got to get back to where we were, in the 1800s, in the early 1900s.
Exactly.
And before we let you go, I want to ask about another project you're involved in. Along with several partners, Living Cities is launching a project called Racial Equity Here, Commit to Action. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that when that sociologist, German sociologist Myrtle came, one of the things he said was this commitment to the greater good. This he called it the American Creed. Is an amazing thing. It's an incredibly unusual thing, but the one unfinished part of the American Creed is how we address and provide opportunity for people of color. He said it's the one thing that Americans have to continue. Its struggle for the soul of America is, from slavery till today. And so we really do believe that a critical element of reclaiming the American dream is actually being honest and forthright that we actually have to end racism and pull down the structural and institutional racism that exists. I think we've done a great job in large part to, individual acts of meanness, we've made a lot of progress on. I think the vast majority of Americans do not do individual acts of meanness, but the long-term effects from slavery to today remain. And so we work with an organization called Race Forward and a program that they have called the Government Alliance for Racial Equity, where there's 100 cities around the country that are putting a racial equity lens on all of their cities' operations to identify institutional and structural racism and then have a plan for bringing that down, for getting rid of it. And as those cities have been working and seeing that, both inside the city but also with partners, we realized that there was a real interest for people to take action, to make a commitment to doing this. And so we said, let's ride that momentum. And we and the Race Forward and others launched this campaign called Racial Equity Here. And you can go online and you can join it. You can see what it's about. We have more than 450 organizations, many of them in these local communities that are working with cities to do this work. But some of them are national companies, Ben & Jerry's and other long leading social companies around the country. And we just think it's critical. You see a lot of, you read the papers, you watch cable television, you think that this is a nation that does not care for each other, does not believe that racial equity is something that is at a cornerstone of America, and these actions that these individuals and these institutions are taking are sending a very different message, a message for our times.
Where is it being used, and what are some of the concrete results that you've seen?
Well, so what we're saying is, if you are already committed to learning about our racial our history, part of the challenge is we've all been socialized in facts about our nation that just aren't complete. And so part of it is, can we learn? Are we committed to learning and helping people learn and educate themselves about our history? It doesn't make us bad people. It just means that's our history. Let's face it, and then let's address it. It's about places that are willing to actually take action, and whether it's inside their own organizations or outside in their own communities. And so it's really those companies and institutions that are already doing that are saying essentially, I'm in. This is what we're already doing, and they're going online and they're saying what they're doing. They're saying what they want to do, and they're seeing that they're part of a much larger community: public, private, philanthropic, individual citizens, and it's part of a movement. And it's a movement that's has a long history in America of trying to make us a better place. As President Obama said, during his term, we're always in the search of making our union, perfecting the union. That's what it's about. It's a fight against cynicism. It's a fight to reclaim the America that we want it to be, and to create opportunities just like this country created for my grandparents and my parents.
Ben Hecht, President and CEO of Living Cities, author of the new book titled Reclaiming the American Dream, Proven Solutions for Creating Economic Opportunity for All, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Ben, thank you so much for your time. We very much enjoyed it and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
I look forward to it too. Thank you for the time.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Insider trading, Nunes caught on tape, Omarosa's new book. Bill Press talks with reporter Mat Laslo.
Here in studio with us, he is a contributor to Rolling Stone. He is a public radio reporter, and he's a professor. Mat Laslo. Hello, Matt.
Nice to having me back.
What's going on, man?
Living the dream.
Aren't we all? Yeah.
Only this time it's not 420, so I didn't bring a joint.
That's
yes,
right.
You did. Of course, yes, you did. Don't lie and say you didn't bring a joint.
He doesn't walk around without one. Right.
Right.
We haven't seen you since 420. Matt he's our go-to guy on 420, of course.
Of course.
Because you've been following the pot wars.
Oh, yeah.
Right. You know what? We talk about the Mendocino complex fire. It is the largest fire in California's history, consuming an area already the size of Los Angeles. It is far, far, far from being contained.
Yeah, it's insane.
But I know Mendocino County well, and the number one crop in Mendocino County.
Oh, really?
Oh, absolutely. No.
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah.
I wonder what the smoke in the air.
Mendocino is.
Yeah, of course. Sure.
Right,
yeah.
right.
I hadn't even thought about that.
But just think of the thousands of acres of pot that's been destroyed.
And is most of that illegally grown, or?
Well, not now in California. Right.
But
I mean,
wonder if-
I don't know whether
Yeah.
they have to have then a license to grow after the initiative passed, but now that the recreational pot is legal in California, I think these pot farms are okay.
Most of them
legal, but
Well,
they were not.
Well, I wonder if
until
that's
a year
going to have an
ago.
uptick in
Prices?
Well, no, for the cartels, because cartels have been losing out on business because of legalization, and if the legal crop burns up, that could be really bad down at the border and stuff.
These remote areas of Mendocino County, that was the heartland of the.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that, but duh.
Wow.
That's, man. You remember that time that someone gave you some of Mendocino's finest while you were out there, right?
That was actually Humboldt County.
Oh, Humboldt County. Humboldt County,
Is
forgive
that the stuff
me.
you brought on the plane?
Another great byproduct
Yes.
of California's Humboldt County is the weed. There,
Right. They still have some redwoods in Humboldt, but
that too.
under the redwoods,
That
it's good,
too.
provides good shade for the pot plants. Yeah. Oh man. So a buddy of yours yesterday got some bad news. Congressman Chris Collins,
Poor guy.
from up in New York State, New York's 27. He had a little news conference yesterday. So Chris Collins was charged by the federal attorneys in New York on base insider trading, securities fraud, insider trading. The story was, they claim, he was at the White House. I love this. At the White House, at the congressional picnic.
Oh, yeah.
He gets a call from the head of this pharmaceutical company he was a big-time investor in, I think the largest shareholder, who said, things didn't go so well today. We were turned down by the FDA on this test for a new drug of ours, which means, of course, the stock is going to plummet the next day. And so Chris Collins immediately gets on the phone to his son and says, sell our stock now, right? Get out while we can.
And there's footage of it. I guess CBS had footage of him on the phone.
Get out.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
From the White House.
From there, because they had B-roll. They were just set up there watching people arrive for the picnic.
Right. But Collins yesterday having had a little news conference saying totally innocent.
I look forward to being fully vindicated and exonerated.
Not only that, he says he is up for re-election this year.
Oh, yeah.
He is running for re-election, and he said this doesn't change anything.
As I fight to clear my name, rest assured, I will continue to work hard for the people and constituents of the 27th Congressional District of New York, and I will remain on the ballot running for re-election this November.
So, Matt, you're around Congress a lot for Rolling Stone. This guy was already being investigated by the Congressional Ethics Committee.
Oh, yeah.
On the same charge.
I mean, poor guy. He just comes down here to drain the swamp. And, he gets caught in this everyday occurrence for average Americans where you get a huge stock tip and you call your son and say, dump, dump, dump. What a guy. So him, right outside the House floor, this is probably 6-8 months ago. Yeah, I actually looked it up on my phone yesterday. I hear him talking stock trades in between House votes. The guy is just shameless. He's off the House floor, just casting a vote. You can't have your cell phone on the House floor.
Yeah.
So he casts his vote. Then he talks stock trades around me and dozens of other reporters. He's just feels like he's impervious. And I think that's a part of, so one of Trump's biggest allies, first congressional endorser, and he was just out in front on him. But there's just something about this administration where they feel so impervious to the laws that they're not impacted at all.
So you're right. He's the first member of Congress to endorse Donald Trump for president. Someone pointed out yesterday, so the people around Donald Trump who have been charged with crimes, right? His first campaign manager.
I don't know if we have that much time, Bill.
No. His first campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, those charges were later dropped, but he's charged, right? His second
for
campaign
assaulting a friend of mine,
assaulting
Michelle Fields.
Right?
Yeah.
His second campaign manager, Paul Manafort.
Yep.
His deputy campaign manager, Rick Gates, right? His national security advisor, Michael Flynn. His foreign policy advisor, George Papadopoulos. And now Chris Collins, right? Now, by the way,
he didn't know any of those people.
There will be more. We didn't get to Donald Jr., Jared Kushner, Roger Stone, go down the list, right? But already, these are all people really close to Donald Trump.
I know. And
by their friends, you shall know them.
Fair. Well, and what are we seeing from Trump and his lawyers? They're just working quickly to wrap up this Russia investigation, trying to put the pressure on Mueller. And I guess to tie it in to our friend Devin Nunes, these people on the Hill are just putting up smoke screens for Trump. It seems. They want to bury this investigation. And Trump and his administration keep saying, no, there's no there. You just gave us a pretty long list of pretty powerful and high up people in his campaign and in his orbit, and yet they say nothing. They say nothing happened. Kill this investigation quickly.
Even after Robert Mueller named 12 Russian government operatives, members of the Russian government, by name, by serial number, by Russian military, by rank, by serial number, the whole thing, Donald Trump still says nothing there. It's a nothing burger, nothing at all. You mentioned Devin Nunes. Devin Nunes, still the chair of the House Oversight Committee. He had to step down.
Intelligence Committee.
Committee. Sorry, that's right. And he had to step away from the Russian investigation because he did such phony stuff with pretending to have all this bombshell.
Colluding with the White House.
To
bury it.
But he's up for re-election too. He yesterday got in a little embarrassment because he didn't know he was live mic again, right?
Yeah.
He didn't know the mic was on. Somebody was taping him. Now the audio, and Rachel Maddow played this last night, but the audio is very hard to understand. We're going to let Peter. We'll play it, and then Peter, you can give us the translation
All
as
right.
well.
Let me let you hear the audio.
But the essence of it is, he says, it's up to us, meaning Republican House members. We're the only ones who can save Donald Trump. Right?
If Sessions won't unrecuse and Mueller won't clear the president, we're the only ones.
All right, so I want to play that one more time.
If Sessions won't
unrecuse.
If Sessions won't unrecuse and Mueller won't clear the president, we're the only ones.
We're the only ones.
Wow.
If Sessions won't unrecuse, if Mueller won't.
Essentially saying if Mueller won't leave the president alone, right?
Right.
Like, I'm not totally sure what he says there, but if he won't.
Then,
but they're the last ones.
We're the only ones.
Yeah.
So he sees the role of Congress, right?
Yeah.
To cover up for the president, right? To protect the president, even though the president is guilty of wrongdoing.
And this is where it's kind of insane.
He sees that as his role.
And this is where partisanship has just run so amok. Congress is a completely separate branch from the White House. I mean, these guys used to be. These guys have no understanding of that.
Under Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, it is not.
And they will do anything. And this is where you want to look at these people and say, hey, you have your own career. And if you want to salvage your party, don't go down with this guy. Don't cover up for him. And just, that's what they see their job is. And I don't see why they don't just wash their hands of it. And again, they already wrapped up their House, quote unquote, investigation into the Russia collusion. Not on the Senate side. The Senate side, we're still seeing a little bit of statesmanship from Democrat Mark Warner and then Republican Richard Burr of North Carolina, who actually has really stood out for not standing out. Yeah. Nunes has been out there lying for the president, trying to cover up for him. And now we have this tape where he freely admits it to the donor class. But that's where Burr does deserve a lot of praise. He's kept his head down. He's investigating. But it's really a shame to see these House Republicans just feeling like their job is to protect Trump at all costs.
Now, talk about the proper role of Congress. To put it in perspective, today is the 44th anniversary of Richard Nixon being forced to step down as president of the United States.
Poor guy.
Right. And in those days, there was a delegation of Republican senators who went to the White House and said, Mr. President, we can no longer defend you. We will no longer defend you. For the good of the country, you have to step down. The idea
could that even happen today
with this batch of chicken, Republicans, never happened. I mean, the only one who might possibly do it is John McCain, and poor John McCain is suffering from brain cancer and may not be back to the Senate.
Well, no.
But Lindsey Graham ran these people that we think are so, Lindsey Graham, he can't play enough golf with Donald Trump. Rand Paul, we think he's independent. Rand Paul, who's the messenger boy to Vladimir Putin right now, delivering letters to Putin from Donald. I mean, they are all, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, forget about it.
And then the people, and this is where I get annoyed.
They'll do anything Trump wants.
Yeah, and this is where I get annoyed because you always see them quoted. But like in the Senate, maybe the two independent Republicans left, Corker and Flake. Oh. Well, but they're both retiring. They're giving up the fight. No, stick around.
Not only are they retiring, but they also cave at any moment.
Yeah.
They still vote for everything Donald Trump wants. They may say a critical word, then they turn around and vote for whatever he wants. They're going to vote for Brett Kavanaugh.
Yeah.
I mean, Corker, who was Mr. Anti-deficit, right? I'm not going to add one penny to the deficit. He voted for that budget-busting bill of Donald Trump, which is going to add probably $2 trillion to the deficit this year. Bob Corker voted for it on his way out. No, zero credibility, zero principles at all. Same thing. I'm sad. Jeff Flake, same thing. They're there until it counts until you need them.
And that's where you see it on both sides. But there's just this groupthink that's taken over Washington. You have no independence, no thoughtfulness from the nation's political class, and it's really a shame. For me, I guess this is why.
Paul Ryan. I mean,
what did you think of the profile of him by Livovich?
I haven't read it yet. I've just read about it.
But, well, I hear that
for those who are not up to date yet, Mark Leibovich, the senior now writer for New York Magazine, has a profile this Sunday.
Oh, yeah.
In the magazine this Sunday, I believe,
think so.
Of Paul Ryan.
And he's been out talking about it. But I guess he doesn't bring up Ryan's desire to change Medicare at all. He doesn't bring up the soaring deficits under Ryan at all. So it seems like he drank the Kool-Aid a little bit.
Let's not paint Paul Ryan as either a successful or effective or legislator, number one, or anything other than a hard-line Republican extremist, really, who wanted to end every government program that helps the middle class or the poor in order to give more tax breaks to the wealthy.
Yeah, that doesn't really make you a policy wonk.
No.
Yeah.
Which is what he's trying to build his entire career.
Exactly. It just makes you a cruel, hard-ass Republican.
Yes.
Yeah.
Tax cuts, though, Bill.
Exactly.
Tax cuts.
That's his whole thing.
That's what's going to be on his grave.
Look at
tax cuts.
Well, tax cuts for the rich. I mean, that's all, and that's why that plus the most extreme judges that you can get are the two things that matter most to most Republicans, certainly to Paul Ryan and to Mitch McConnell. And the reason why we've said this so many times on this program, there is nothing Donald Trump could do. As he famously said, he could walk out on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and these Republicans in Congress would do nothing. Why? Because Donald Trump will appoint their judges and sign their tax cuts.
And you know what they're doing when they come back in the fall in the House? Tax cut 2.0. Because they want to make permanent
the tax cuts that expire.
So they want to do it this fall.
Well, you knew that was coming.
But all they want, they're just they just have one tune that they play. Mm-hmm. And but if you look at the president's numbers And this is kind of the scary thing. His numbers don't budge. And I think he's fine with that. There's energy on their side. The money's just pouring in. So even Nunez, we were just talking about him, the numbers that he's pulling in for his race, millions. He's become this star for covering up for Trump. And
I wish I'd, as a Californian, former chair of the California Democratic Party, I wish I could say we have a really good shot at knocking Nunez off this year. I think there's a good chance of picking up as many as 5 seats from Republicans in California. But the Nunez seat is not one of them.
Yeah.
Most likely. Sadly.
Yeah.
Sadly. So as an outsider, I don't think you've been covering it, but as an outsider, what's your take on the Paul Manafort trial? Does it look like Mueller's got a strong case?
I don't know. I love these trials. They're so beautiful, especially watching Rick Gates admitting that he pilfered hundreds of thousands of dollars from Manafort and his former boss, partner. I love it.
He had his little love nest in London.
See, that's what I just love. These people are so sleazy. So this is better than daytime soap operas. All the President's Friends.
Yeah,
someone should start that show. I'd watch that.
But it looks to me like it's pretty airtight case. I mean, even the defense, Manafort's defense is not saying he did not commit any crimes. He's saying Rick Gates committed these crimes, therefore you can't believe him.
Yeah.
They haven't yet denied that Paul Manafort committed any crimes.
No.
They can't. I think the evidence is just overwhelming.
And we'll see.
Yesterday they had the finance officer, right from the firm, who had all the documents and who filed all these things, who just went through the list of every illicit financial transaction.
It's beautiful. But who even knows? Because Manafort, I don't know. I get nervous making any predictions these days. I mean, for one, Trump is our president, so I was wrong on that.
Yeah.
So after that, I got out of the prediction game. But, right?
We all should have.
Right.
Yeah.
But this is a good one to watch. Who even knows? Because this is just case one. It's still has to be tried in the district too, right? Because this one's in Northern Virginia.
Yeah, the second trial is next month in here in Washington, D.C., and the only question is whether Trump pardons Paul Manafort.
I know.
After the first trial, or does he wait until after the second trial to pardon him?
And Republicans wouldn't care. Trump is just readying his pardon pen.
Oh, again, Congress won't. If he can pardon Paul Manafort, no. Republicans, his base will love it.
Right?
Yeah. His base will show. This shows that he's a compassionate person, right? He's a compassionate conservative. Yeah. He pardoned Paul Manafort.
I want to know Trump's reaction to Omarosa and her audio.
Oh, man.
We talked about that.
Daily Beast, one of my other clients, Daily Beast got audio, or I guess reported that she used to record the president, which is...
Yeah.
We haven't heard the audio. She hasn't released the audio, but she used it to sort of gain leverage for her book deal, which is coming out very soon.
Pretty soon.
Like maybe even next week. But she has recordings of Donald Trump that he did not know she was recording him.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. Unhinged is the name of her book.
Sounds like it's about him.
Yeah.
And about her.
True.
You're right. It comes out it comes out very soon. It just says pending here, but yeah. So imagine that. So you're in the White House. You're working for the President of the United States. And what did she do? Do you think she used her iPhone or something? But
I would imagine so.
I don't think like she wasn't wired for the FBI.
Right.
It was just that she did it on her own. Okay. At that time, she's Trump's baby. I mean, I used to see her in the briefing room. She was very much a part of the team. Why would she do that? Because she knew that he would eventually turn against her, maybe? Or
probably.
Or even at that time, she was thinking of writing a book.
Well, there's no loyalty in Trump land.
No, there's no zero loyalty.
Loyalty to himself.
Good point.
She
no
is
loyalty in Trump land.
There's no other way to put it. She is a protege of Donald Trump, right? Like we saw this happen on air, live on air. She was one of the very first contestants on The Apprentice.
Yes.
And tied herself to Donald Trump all throughout his career. But she said, apparently, in the book, that I forgot what moment it was. Maybe it was the Charlottesville thing. That she watched him make these statements and she realized that there was something very, very wrong with him.
Huh.
And that might be why she started taping him. But that's apparently a big part of the book is he is not well. She saw it. Oh, you know what it was? It was you know what I remember what it was. It was his very first press conference, which was rambling.
Oh God,
and insane.
Yeah,
totally insane. She said she watched that.
Yeah,
she said she watched that and said he has lost a step and he's not well, and she got very concerned. But she kept working for him for several months after that.
But that's the most beautiful thing, that we're going to take this reality TV star's word over this reality TV star. God, this show is getting so bad. It's almost predictable.
But you did point out there is no loyalty at all.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, this is, you talk about the bizarro world. Yesterday, Rudy Giuliani talks about whether or not Donald Trump's going to sit down with Robert Mueller.
Yeah.
And he gives an amazing interview to that great talk show host, Jay Sekulow, who happens to be his partner, attorney for Donald Trump. So Donald Trump's two lawyers are talking about this issue on one of their radio shows. Here Rudy making this incredible argument.
Honestly, he's got all the information that he needs. The interview will provide nothing in addition to what he already has. So he can write his report. And we've been willing to profit. In other words, we've been willing to say, this is the answer he will give. And we'll be stuck with it.
All right. So, Matt, you're a college professor. What if your student said to you, we'll just send you the answers. We don't have to come in to take the test. We don't have to come in to answer any questions. We'll just send you our answers ahead of time.
Perfect. This is how things work in the Twitter world.
Yeah, right?
That's
insane.
I know, the mindset of these people. And who knows? But watching Giuliani and Sekulow do that, for one, it's a little unsettling because they literally just want this prosecuted out in the public. That's what they're going for, it seems like.
Yeah. But you know also what? They're just not willing to say. There is no way that they'll do anything they can to prevent Donald Trump from being questioned by Robert Mueller.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Richard Kahlenberg, Ben Hecht, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.